Brian Weiss here from ITECH Solutions. We're a managed service provider here on the Central Coast, California. Currently service small businesses all the way to large businesses ranging up to 7,000 employees. Larger businesses, we tend to help in more of a co-managed aspect where we're helping internal IT teams, fill gaps, augment, coaching, consulting. Today we're here with Justin Maire from Morris Garritano. You want to tell me a little about yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Justin Maire with Morris Garritano Insurance. We are an insurance agency / brokerage. I'm a partner. I've been there, about 25 years now. We were named last year one of the 50 largest independent agencies in the nation. We've kind of gotten more and more into cyber insurance, the last probably 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
It's one of those things, didn't really exist prior to that. Wasn't really a threat when everyone was sending faxes and phone calls, and now it's more of an issue than it's really ever been. And so we've kind of become experts in that field just in the last 5 to 10 years, and dealing it with our clients, seeing the claims and then helping them find insurance coverage for that, and partnering with IT companies like Brian and ITECH, other ones to help them, secure their data and their systems as much as possible. And then we provide insurance solutions kind of as a backup.
Yeah. And what's your position over there?
I'm an owner, I'm a partner, but technically my role is senior risk advisor.
Senior risk advisor. So we're in the right spot. We're going to talk about risk around compliance today. And, there's maybe start out by just kind of pointing out cybersecurity versus compliance. They do not equal each other. I look at compliance as adhering to a framework, a set of best practices, if you will, that really incorporates, not just technology, which you might see cybersecurity as more of a technology approach to securing things. But compliance really encompasses people, process, and technology. And we'll get into this more later, but I feel like compliance even requires more of a culture shift within a company, involving the people more, improving processes that the people follow, and use technology to help automate. But jumping right into kind of compliance risk itself, and with the fact where we've got kind of a healthcare spin on this, we do want to focus on the healthcare industry. What types of things from a risk perspective have you dealt with healthcare providers or medical offices when it comes to insurance, cybersecurity insurance? I guess leading the question a little more, they have this questionnaire that they have to fill out, right?
Oh, for the insurance?
To even qualify for the insurance. And can you share kind of some experiences around that and how you've helped with that? Or
yeah, well, the questionnaire, and depending on the insurance company, and right now there's probably a couple dozen different insurance companies that provide cyber insurance. Mm-hmm. And depending on the insurance company, the questionnaires can range from, one page that's 6 questions, just kind of says, what's the name of your business? What field are you in? How much do you do in sales? And that's it. To the questionnaire that's, might be 6, 7 pages long, that dives into everything, cybersecurity wise, that you guys are doing. And at least in my experience, the ones that ask more questions typically are the carriers that you want to be with, mm-hmm. because they're the ones that really want to make sure that you're providing the right cybersecurity and compliance already. And if you're not, make sure that you're doing that before they will insure you. Mm-hmm. And those are the carriers too that will help you with some of those things once you're a policy holder, making sure, because they're insurance companies, they don't want to have claims. So they don't want you to have claims.
So wait,
And
insurance isn't in the business to pay out claims? Is that what you're telling
not
me?
necessarily,
Okay,
no. And so
all
those are the carriers that will help you make sure your system is secure, and work with, your IT team, to do that. But the questionnaires, yeah, it depends on the insurance company. They can be really easy or they can be pretty in depth. And typically the in depth ones, we just tell, those businesses, we'll get calls to say, hey, I need help with this. How do I answer some of these? And, honestly, those questions are like a foreign language to them and to me a lot of the times. Say, talk to your IT team. They'll be able to answer these for you because, most people don't speak that language. and, and it's got a lot of backups and security and multi-factor authentication and everything that the business is doing or medical providers doing to keep things secure.
Yeah, these questionnaires, I mean, if we look at healthcare, there's HIPAA compliance, right? Which is it's a framework to help keep patient data protected and private. And that's really what cybersecurity insurance ultimately is to help cover. If unfortunately, if you did have a claim, they would help cover damages associated to a loss of access to the patient data. Hopefully it's not, breached where it's out in the public. But I imagine you want to be very truthful on those, right? Because, I mean, the insurance company doesn't just, I mean, they might take your word for it on the initial questionnaire, but I imagine if an incident does happen and you put in a claim, they're probably going to want to do their due diligence to verify that what you said on the questionnaire was true. Have you seen situations like that?
Exactly. And so, those questionnaires that you have to complete to get cyber insurance, the ones that are more extensive, this is why it's important to have your IT team complete those.
Yeah.
Is, if you answer them incorrectly and then there is a claim, the insurance company can come back and say, well, for example, you said you had multi-factor authentication and you don't.
Yeah.
You lied on the application, and that's how this incident occurred, and they can deny the claim. And we've seen, I've actually only seen one case where someone did put the incorrect information on the application, and then they had a claim a month later after they issued coverage, and it was a large ransomware claim, and the insurance company came back and they were trying to decide whether or not they would provide coverage or not. And that business said, we were in the process of implementing this when we answered it, and we thought it would be in place at the time, this happened. It wasn't quite done yet. And the insurance company, in that case, actually did the good thing, came back, said, okay, we can see that you were in the process of implementing this. It wasn't done yet. You answered, you had it on the application, and they didn't end up paying that claim, which is good. But a lot of insurance companies wouldn't have. That was a good insurance carrier, and we were able to get that done. But those applications, yeah, they're important that they're answered correctly. Otherwise, you're paying for a product for this insurance that may not be there if you need it.
It's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up, and how we can't. There's no guarantee the insurance company is going to give you a little slack, but I wonder if sometimes when we get questionnaires from some of our clients, it's a little last minute, right? And it's like, well, shoot, we'd love to answer yes to this, but it's going to take some time. It requires a project. There's going to be an end user impact. We're going to have to do some end user training around this new process. MFA is a good example, right? You can't just flip it on overnight. It sounds like this type of insurance, you want to plan ahead further, right? If you've got a renewal date coming up or you're wanting to get covered by a certain date, what do you recommend as like, hey, we should start planning now and get our IT involved at this point in time, right?
Yeah, the earlier, you can implement these things to protect your business, the better. And the reason I say that is not just from an insurance standpoint or being able to get insurance, but we've seen so many claims, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, either ransomware, theft of money, and everybody has these situations where you may have your controller here, that gets an email, it looks like it came from you. It says, hey, I need you to transfer this money over, or I need you to do this. They know you, so they know that, okay, I'm not going to get an email from Brian that says that.
No.
You know, but the people that do this stuff now are becoming, more sophisticated.
Yeah.
And so now what we see them do a lot is they'll be in the business's computer system, just kind of watching what they're doing, who they're talking to, what meetings they've got set up. So for example, they may see that Brian has got this podcast today with me, and you may get an email later and it looks like it's coming from me saying, hey, here's the information we discussed. Or, if it's around tax season, you may get it, they see you're talking to your accountant. You may get an email, it looks like it's coming from your accountant. Here's a copy of your tax info. And you click on that and you download it. And now you've got ransomware.
Mm-hmm.
And so the guys that are doing this, they're just getting more and more sophisticated and finding better ways to try and trick you into letting them breach your system. And so it's, the sooner you can do it, the better. But from an insurance standpoint, what we do a lot is we'll say, here's what they have right now, and here's what they're planning to implement in the next year. And a lot of the cyber insurance companies then will say, okay, if they can implement this in the next 3 months, we'll provide the coverage, or that sort of thing. And so it's, we just be upfront with them and let them know this is what we want to do over the next year. But you can use that to get good coverage now. If you have a plan that hasn't been done yet, but it's maybe in progress.
So it's better to be honest on the application and ask for guidance, right? And maybe some extra time to get things implemented than it is to straight out lie and act like you already have it done. Right?
100%.
And then I think too, just kind of touching on that, the original question, if you have a renewal coming up, is it always the same questionnaire year over year, or does it change?
No, the renewals are different, and depending on the insurance company, like some of the better cyber insurance carriers, for example, Travelers, if they have a renewal coming up, their forensics team, their cyber team may actually try to breach your system. And so we had one large client that their renewal is coming up, and the insurance company let us know. It was probably 60 days ahead of the renewal, said, hey, they've got an open port at their office down in Mexico, and we need to close this up before we'll offer a renewal. And the insurance company they want to help make sure, both for them and for the policyholder,
sure,
that nobody can get in, because it's, like I said, they don't want to pay out claims if they don't have to.
Yeah.
But they worked with that business to help them close that port. They were trying to find it. Their IT team, then the forensics team from the insurance company got in touch with them, helped them find it, helped them close it. It went past the expiration date or the renewal date, but the insurance company said, hey, we'll give you a 30-day extension to help you close this. Mm-hmm. They closed that port, went through, said, okay, your system's secure, here's your renewal. And it's, they stayed with them. And since then, we've actually got cheaper alternatives to move the insurance to for cyber. But they said, we really like these guys, and they've helped us, and we'll pay more to stay with them.
How are you familiar with helping your clients follow HIPAA regulations at all, or is it mainly just adhering to cybersecurity questionnaires?
It's, I'm not too familiar with HIPAA law.
Okay.
I do know that, obviously there's more risks or, different factors that, people in the medical field have to deal with keeping this information secure than, say, your manufacturer. So if you have a data breach and you're, in your medical and you're violating HIPAA laws, and you've got fines and penalties attached to, and the insurance policy is not going to pay the fines and penalties, but you can get a different insurance policy for HIPAA violations that would pay that. The insurance policy, the cyber policy, what it would do is if there's a ransom, it would pay that ransom, sure, which is, we've talked about this. It's good and bad. If you're a policy holder, you want the insurance company to pay the ransom to release your system back to you. But at the same time, having insurance companies that pay the ransoms, the guys that do this stuff, they know that. And I say it encourages it, but they know a lot of businesses have $1 million policy, and it's a lot of money for them when there's insurance companies that will pay that ransom. But the insurance company pays the ransom. It pays any loss in income. If you're shut down for a while, and now more medical is doing telehealth and things like that. And so, if you can't access any of your system, any of your records, any of your data, you've got issues there, may have a loss in income because of it. The insurance will pay that. If you have lawsuits that come from patients because now their information's out there, the insurance will pay for that. But yeah, it doesn't pay the fines and penalties that you would possibly incur because of the HIPAA violations.
Do you find that insurance companies, I know they have this questionnaire and they want to know about the business. If it is a healthcare company or a medical office, does the questionnaire change at all? Is it more restrictive or more HIPAA focused, or is it kind of just the same? Because as you mentioned, there is kind of separate insurance policies related specifically to HIPAA.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and so it doesn't, what the insurance companies look at primarily is just how secure is your network? How secure is your data? Can anyone get in? And they look at the same information from, someone in the medical field as they would anyone else, whether manufacturing or even us, insurance agency. But there are different insurance companies. So some insurance companies that provide cyber won't insure business in the medical field because they feel it's maybe a little riskier.
Yeah, I mean, you're dealing with sensitive patient data, right? And there's privacy laws that have to be adhered to. So that's interesting because when we think about compliance as a whole, especially in HIPAA, it's not just, hey, I was able to answer everything yes on a cybersecurity insurance questionnaire, because that's more directed around, to your point, like protecting your network access to the data. But there's other compliance factors that go into HIPAA. Again, that's kind of more technology focused. What about people in process, disclosing of information, what type of human error might be able to be introduced into that? Maybe can you talk to some of these HIPAA specific policies? Have you worked with those as much to talk about what those look like?
They're out there. To tell you the truth, haven't seen many claims there, but they are if there's a data breach and a lot of patient information is released. There's the two sides. The cyber policy is going to cover any lawsuits and even covers notification expenses and all that to those people whose information's out there. And then if there is a HIPAA violation or penalty or anything that's incurred, that's the separate policy over there. And a lot of them actually that we've seen, if you've got a medical policy that covers a liability and professional liability for your medical practice, many of those will include some sort of coverage for HIPAA violations.
Okay. That's good. That's good to know. The last podcast I had Brad Gross on, who's a lawyer. And one of the things he mentioned, when we started getting into the costs associated with, not following compliance and getting caught somehow, he mentioned there's also the fact of the lawyers coming after you, like class action lawsuits.
Oh, yeah.
Things like that.
No, and that, to be honest, some of the largest claims we've seen are the class action lawsuits. It's just an attorney.
Yeah.
That says, we represent all these people and we're coming after you. And that could be an issue if there's a data breach and now you've got 1,000 people whose information may be out there, whether it's been used, in a bad way or not, it's just out there.
Yep.
Now you could have one of those types of claims, and that's where the insurance does come in handy because it will defend you in that lawsuit. The other thing I was going to say is, particular the medical network is, there's so many vendors out there too that you may be working with if you're in the medical field, where you've got your practice, but you may be sharing data with a lab who's separate, or a radiology person over here, or all these different, vendors that this information is going back and forth, and it may not just be your system being out of compliance or, that has an opening, but if it's someone over here now where your patient's information is released because of that, it's another risk factor. At least the insurance companies, some of them say we don't want to work or insure anybody in the medical field because they're riskier than some other types of industries.
Yeah, it's, we call that supply chain in the IT industry is kind of, what other vendors are you dealing with? What data of yours do they have? Are you responsible for it or not? I know when I go to medical offices, I'm typically signing a form that's like, hey, my wife's allowed to see my records and you're allowed to share my records with, other medical offices, or maybe it's a one-off thing where I'm working, I'm going to a lab and I'm filling out a form saying, yeah, it's okay to share my data between the lab and the doctor. And I wonder, maybe this is a question for a lawyer, unless you have any insight on this. I wonder where the liability ends, right? Like, because if the data is created by the lab and then shared with the doctor, do they both have shared liability, like a shared responsibility around that, I imagine? Or or can they point fingers at each other?
That's a good question. Yeah. Or, if you've got all their information was the lab and they send it to you, and then you have the data breach, now the lab gets sued.
Yeah.
Can the lab come after you?
Yeah.
As well?
Typically, I'm sure there's chain of custody, laws there that get involved with, who's responsible for it. I know that when we work with our clients to share out sensitive data, we have this thing called data loss prevention that we DLP for short. Data governance is another term that's used. And it's the idea that ideally you want to be able to maintain, if it's data you created, right, you're initially responsible for it. And if you have to share it with another party, how can you maintain governance as you're sharing it out to where you can even revoke that, right? We're not quite there yet with a lot of the systems people are using. We use Microsoft, which has some of those capabilities built in, where you could even share out information and have it be eyes only, where they can't even download a copy, and then that sharing expires over time. And then, if I really want to jump to the future, we have blockchain technology that does an even better job at chain of custody and who can see what and when, how, and where. But I think that's good to consider too, is, it's, what vendors are we working with, and have we vetted their security as well? And if we find issues with that or concerns, are we voicing that with the vendor or the partner, or are we sweeping it under the rug, acting like that's their problem, not mine? It can eventually come back and affect us directly, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
We've seen, where a vendor has an error, and now it can affect your business, both from an income standpoint. If, say for example, a vendor has a cyber attack and now all their information's on lockdown because they're under ransomware, and now you're not able to get copies or that data from them. Now it affects your ability to help your patient. It can be an issue. Those are things that cyber insurance will cover, as loss of income, even if it's not you, but if it's a dependent, business that you work with that has an issue. We saw one, actually it wasn't us, just had to deal with it. Not the medical industry, but I don't know if you heard about it last summer. I found out because I went to buy a car for my daughter, and the operating system that most auto dealerships use got ransomware, and it was shut down. And so there's 15,000 auto dealerships now that couldn't sell any cars because the operating system they use, those guys had ransomware.
Gotcha.
And so we went to buy a car for my daughter, and they had to bring everything out, like the old credit card scanner, like you used to do in the 90s. And everything was hand applications. We had to do it all by hand. And the auto dealership, was talking to him. He goes, God, this was down for maybe 4 or 5 weeks. So this is going to cost us, maybe $1 million. And my understanding, just reading about it, is in the Wall Street Journal, and you can probably Google it, is all those auto dealerships then sued that operating company, system company, for who knows how much. And I don't think they're around any longer, for their loss in income because that system was down. And so I was talking to the auto guy. I go, God, do you have cyber insurance? He goes, no, I don't. I said, if you had cyber insurance, it would reimburse you for the loss in sales because of this.
Yep.
Because even it's a business that you work with that had the incident, and it's affecting your business's ability to make income.
Yeah, the challenge I see with cybersecurity and compliance, I mean, it feels like we're all just trying to run a business. We've got goals, we got business outcomes we're trying to reach. And when you think about improving security, that doesn't really help the bottom line too much. In fact, I look at it as almost like a balance between security and convenience, right? The more security you add, things tend to get less convenient. The more convenience you add, it feels like the quicker you can get things done and potentially reach these goals and business outcomes. And I almost wish there was a culture shift where people were proud to wear security as a badge, even though they had to sacrifice some convenience, almost like it's an award system where we're awarding companies to think security first, ultimately, building sticking to some sort of compliance framework that they even get their employees to buy into, almost like a core value, if you will, right?
Yeah.
In the company is like, hey, we don't want to cut corners. We realize we have a business to run and we want to take care of our clients or our patients, but ultimately security comes first, right? And I think compliance is a good approach. If we're going back to healthcare again, it's almost like preventative care, if to prevent things, a mishap from happening, right? So if we think, I go to my doctor and he recommends, hey, follow this diet, get this exercise, get plenty of sleep, right? Preventative care items that if you don't do these, 5 to 10 years from now, you're going to feel the effects of not doing those, right? It's like we call tech debt. When you're not investing properly in technology, it's debt you're building up that eventually comes knocking on your door, right? It's health care debt maybe for the human body, where it's like, hey, I'm not taking care of myself, and it's eventually going to come knocking on my door one day, right? So when you work, let's talk about healthcare, medical offices just in general. I mean, they all have a business to run. I mean, I think of a doctor, let's talk a smaller medical practice, and his number one goal is like, I want to be able to see as many patients as I can and give them the best care possible and move the needle with their health. So I see them getting healthier, right? Mm-hmm. The last thing they're thinking about is security or compliance. Do we have an idea? Like, I know medical offices we run into, I'm not walking in and they're not like, they don't have like a HIPAA award up on the wall talking about, how closely they're following HIPAA. Do we feel like this is something that does need to be talked about more, especially from an insurance perspective, where we should be doing better at compliance?
Yeah, it's tough to say.
I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus. We're not going to name any names, but just in general, right?
Just in general, I think that, most medical practices, at least the ones that we work with, and I think the ones that I've visited, they're familiar with HIPAA.
Yeah.
And they say, okay, this is something we have to comply with. Some of them may not know all the rules of HIPAA and do their best to follow it, but I think everyone's aware of it and says, okay, we need to do this. We need to do this, but they may not know. They may think they're doing a good job though too. They may think that their system is secure and they've they're getting an A on, as a grade for HIPAA compliance, but don't really know until someone comes in and goes, okay, actually, you're out of compliance on a handful of things. And so I think that's what, we've run into more often than not is they want to be doing it. They think they're doing it, but they don't know until, someone comes in and looks at everything, goes, okay, gosh, your system was wide open, or, we can improve on this.
So to put it in legal terms, we're not necessarily saying there's willful negligence, but
There may be some of that out there too. But I don't know, but
maybe more just general
just assistance, really.
ignorant negligence, right? Maybe they feel like they're following it, but should probably have someone come in and do a true audit and help them understand where there might still be some gaps. And you've realized that just through helping them get insured.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And everyone that we work with that's in the medical field, it's a concern, HIPAA,
Yeah.
and they want to be doing everything they can to meet all the requirements and be compliant. But a lot of them honestly don't know if they are or not. And they kind of go, I think we're doing this. I think, we have to make sure all this information is safe. But, they may not be sure how safe it actually is.
And, and we're all busy, right? We're all, like I said, trying to see patients, trying to give them the care they need. So I imagine there's a time limitation, and it might seem even intimidating at first without realizing, hey, there's resources that can help that are out there. And make it a lot easier.
A lot of it now is, so much of it's just technological and IT, and you've got all this information that's stored electronically, and just making sure that is secure. Nobody can access that. And like I said earlier, the people that are trying to get it, they're making a lot of money by stealing this information. Mm-hmm. And that's where companies like yours and other IT companies come in, and they make sure that that's safe. And then you've got the insurance there as a backup in case somebody does get in or does other things to affect your system or your information or your ability to access that data.
Yeah, maybe let's talk about the most common things that you've seen. Is it still phishing that's out there? People get phished with their credentials. You mentioned also electronic theft.
Yeah,
another one you see.
The two areas where we see the most claims is everybody's constantly getting phished.
Yeah.
Everybody. If you've got a computer system in a business, you're getting phished. But the two areas where we see that do the most damage are ransomware, and then the other one is just theft of funds.
Okay.
And the theft of funds may not be as big of an issue, for a medical provider unless, you're buying, you've got vendors that you're paying a lot of money to, or you're buying, medical equipment and devices, and money's going out that way. Because what they'll do is, they'll see what you're buying. They'll be in your system. They'll see, again, who you're talking to and what you're purchasing. And, an invoice may get sent to you for, hey, you just bought this medical piece of equipment or supplies for $500,000. Mm-hmm. And the invoice is sent to you, and they block that and they send their own invoice. And the invoice is coming, you see it, and it looks just like it came from the right people, and you pay it. And now
just doing your job, right?
You don't know it went to the wrong person until now another invoice comes in from the right guy, is going, hey, you still owe this. You go, wait, I paid that. And then by then it's too late. That money's gone. And so things like that, and then the ransomware, the two biggest things we see are most, highest dollar wise that will affect those businesses.
And what's interesting about both of those instances is, getting back to compliance, really encompassing people, process, and technology. As an IT provider who, specializes in cybersecurity, yeah, we can do anti-phishing, campaigns, or even security and try to catch those and prevent them from coming in. But both of those instances, it sounds like they're more human error, right? It was a human that made a decision to do
Some of them
something.
are, but the root of it is they've got somebody is in their system watching what they're doing. And that's the main thing, is keeping those guys out.
Yeah,
And, and you probably know more about this than I do, but at least what the insurance companies tell us is that 90% of these claims that happen like that, where somebody's in there watching, they could have been prevented if they have multi-factor authentication.
yeah, that's a fair call out, right? That's still the low hanging fruit, I guess. Yeah, and to your point, um, yeah, the minute that your credentials get phished, that's not when the bomb goes off, right? That just
Yeah.
then gives them access to start monitoring to see how, what their opportunities might look like. Hey,
Yep.
I'm in this system now. Let's see what I can possibly do. Is it electronic theft? Do I have that opportunity? Is it the access to data that, I can encrypt and then, turn into a ransomware event? And this is why I feel like compliance needs to be part of the culture too, is, the people that are dealing with big payments like that, where's their multi-factor to verify, hey, this is actually a bill I should pay or money I should send? Um, and when it comes to the phishing emails, that's typically how they'll get into a system, is someone falls for a phishing email
Mm-hmm.
and then gives the actor credentials. There's even sophisticated phishing that's happening now where they'll even steal an MFA token.
Yeah.
So even if you have MFA enabled, they'll grab a token. And so there's new methods of MFA now that we're moving clients to prevent token theft, as they call it. Yeah, I still wonder if we just need to do a better job training. And I also think about, like, an employee of a company, sometimes, if they're getting security training or being told, here's how we need to protect data, maybe they aren't relating to it as much as if they could compare that to their own life, right? Your personal life, you've got, what's important, your photos, videos of your family you never want to lose, the money in your bank account, right? Maybe sensitive documents that you've got that you don't want to get out that could lead to identity theft. And so one of the things that we've been really trying to help with is, hey, this security training isn't just for the company that you work for to help protect its data and prevent an issue from happening. Try to apply this to your own life too. And if I feel like if we can get more buy-in from any employee of an organization, whether you're an executive or an executive assistant, where you're doing these common practices at home, you're more likely to adhere to better security practices in the workforce too.
Oh, totally. I mean, I got cyber insurance for me personally now. Saw my homeowner's policy. I got a letter in the mail. They offer cyber insurance. I looked at it and I said, okay, add that in, just because we see so many claims, and
I'm going to have to admit, I do not have it personally, but I'm going to take that down as a note to look into, because I thought I had every insurance policy under the sun, and that's one I'm missing. Does that include like identity theft insurance as well?
at least mine does.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
got identity theft and just, what worries me is if somebody, I do a lot of online banking and things like that. If somebody, and again, talk about people think they've got good security. I don't know what I have on my personal computer. I think it's fairly secure,
Yeah.
but if who knows? And so if somebody gets my bank information, is able to steal money, or who knows? And it was pretty inexpensive. It was like $100 for the year or something to add it. I said, okay, give me the highest limit I can get.
But what about an incident response plan?
Yeah, that's a great item to touch on. You know, when an incident does happen, I think we've been talking about compliance so much without forgetting that part of compliance is having a proper incident response plan. Um, you know, and there's multiple incidents that could happen. You know, I think ideally you've got an incident response plan that coincides with your insurance policy so that you're not doing things that they may not want you to do. Have you talked with that at all about clients or how that might align with their insurance policy?
You know, normally we see it not proactively,
Mhm.
really, but so the incident response plan, a lot of times they'll put it together with their IT team. For what we see is how the insurance company handles it. You know, and that's part of having the cyber policy too, is, you know, you now have this insurance company that the moment something happens and they're notified, now they've got their forensics team coming in and going through your whole system. A lot of times they'll work with their IT team, say, okay, who's doing this? This is what we need to check. When did this happen? How do we fix this? And they're on it immediately. And they're working with that business to then get things back up and running along with their IT team to figure out what went wrong and how do we get things back up and running as quickly as possible. Because every minute they're down is costing that business money. Yeah, that's money the insurance company has to pay. So they got incentive really to try and get it wrapped up quickly. But they'll work with the IT team, and then the best insurance companies have their own, you know, forensics team, and a lot of those guys are FBI or former FBI that, you know, are helping with that and assisting the business get things cleaned up pretty quickly. I mean, I don't know. What do you guys do for
Well, yeah, you know, it's different now than it used to be. You know, when I think in the earlier days, and you know, we dealt with this back in 2018, where you know there's a claim to the insurance company, and they're like, okay, go ahead and mitigate everything and track all your expenses and report back to us, right? And now there's a lot more handholding. I think insurance companies have realized that for a successful, you know, incident response to minimize the size of the claim they're ultimately going to pay out, it's really all about, you know, mitigating damages that have been done or, you know, stopping the bleeding, if you will, right? And business continuity because there's loss of income while the business is down that might be part of a claim. So it's kind of how do you plan for that? You know, how do you keep your business running if there's an event? You brought up a good example of the car auto dealerships that they're like, well, I guess we're back to paper. Now it slowed them down, so they still had loss of income, but it's not like they couldn't do business at all. And then as far as kind of the stopping the bleeding, using that term because we're talking healthcare, you know, it's how can, you know, how far have they gotten into the system? How can we stop them in their tracks now? And how can we get them out of our system, eliminating any back doors they might have put in, right? And how to, you know, it's really to your point, forensics analysis where you're trying to find an audit trail of how they originally got in, what have they done since they got in, and ultimately identifying the scope of what needs to be cleaned up, repaired, fixed, blocked, better secured. How did it happen in the first place so that we can update our compliance, our security to prevent it from happening again. So, you know, our incident responses, you know, at a high level, you know, I think you need to make sure that there's responsible parties. You need to have a good communication plan. You need to make sure, especially this day and age, that it aligns with what your insurance company wants you to be doing so that you aren't negligent following any requirements of your policy that might be in there that could cause your claim to not go through because, you know, one example is, you know, if a server gets ransomed, it's not let's wipe the server, rebuild it, and restore from backup. Well, you've just gotten rid of the audit trail of what even happened in the first place and all the forensics that you need to know. And how do you know the server was the only point that they got into your system? So it's almost like ideally you want to freeze a point in time, use a backup system that's completely disconnected from the system affected while that system gets analyzed and determine the full length of damage and how they got in, and then very rarely are you going back to using that existing system because it's just easier to run off of a newer system that is clean at that point. So, just like you'd have an incident response for fire. What happens if there's a fire? Well, you've got a fire exit plan, right? You've got extinguishers everywhere. You've got smoke alarms. You've got all the things to protect the humans and get them out of the buildings safely. We got to think of that same thing when it comes to cyber, but more focused, less on the human aspect that, fires, humans come first, of course, and more on the data. Where's all our data at? What data did they touch? How did they get to the data? And so it's not something I recommend having a one-page incident response plan. It's also not something that I don't know if I recommend having like a 40-page one because when you're in the middle of an incident like that, you don't want to have to sit there and read a novel. You want something that's quick and easy and where there's multiple parties that have different responsibilities. It is a shared responsibility. It's not just all on IT. And even insurance companies know this because they bring in a legal team, right? They bring in a forensics team. If there's Bitcoin involved, they'll even bring in like a Bitcoin broker who literally does the negotiations with the threat actor because they always ask for way too much. What if we do have to pay out the Bitcoin, what's the lowest amount we can pay? Bitcoin isn't easy to get your hands on. So it's not like you can just open a bank account, a Bitcoin account today and buy a bunch. There's like, you have to do identity verification and all this stuff. So it takes several days to even get a Bitcoin account established. So that's the purpose of the Bitcoin broker to be there. And then, if there's any public fallout, you're going to definitely have a public relations team involved, a PR team that needs to be part of that incident response plan too.
In fact, the incident response plan, to go back to those applications, they'll ask that in a lot of the applications. Yep. Do you have an incident response plan?
Yep.
And it's not something we put together, but something, maybe you guys help with. Or
yep, 100%. Yeah, and I would go as far as even recommending once you feel like you have an incident response plan, sharing it with the insurance company and saying, here's our incident response plan. How would you recommend we might improve this? Or at the very least, does this align with what you find acceptable? Should we have an incident and we want to make a claim? They might give, or if you don't even have one, I'm sure the insurance companies could give you something boilerplate to work with that's at least comes from them, right? Here's our incident response plan. Here's how we deal with your claims in an incident response manner. And then ultimately having you fill in the gaps of the shared responsibility areas where it's, these are the things that you handle as a client of the insurance company versus the things that the insurance company will handle.
Yeah, I've never seen one provide an incident response plan, but they will ask if you have one in place and what is included in it sometimes.
Maybe I'm waving my magic wand and wishing that happened because it seems reasonable that you want to work together on something like that.
Yeah,
but maybe there's some legal aspects that I'm not thinking about.
It'd be nice. I mean, they don't go that far, at least from what I've seen. But well, maybe if you buy enough limits,
maybe I'll be the guy that starts convincing them to do that if I can.
Yeah, you work with them. So I'll provide the boilerplate for you. And then they can provide it to the policyholders.
It does ultimately lead to better success for incident response. I think if we understand it's a shared responsibility, there's multiple parties involved, and all the parties involved were part of even helping develop that initial incident response plan, right? When you think about it high level. So why isn't it happening that way? Well, those are other questions to be answered, I guess.
That's good. So, as we wind this down, before we give out how do people contact you guys, I don't sound much like Oz right now, do I? The voice is going. But, I always do like the one broadcast announcer. And I'll say, Justin, what's your last word on this?
My last word is, any business, whether you're in the medical field or not, right now, it's something that you need to or should be looking into, providing the top, making sure your business is as secure as possible. And now we're recommending cyber insurance really to every client we work with, just because we've seen a lot of claims and a lot of high dollar claims. And so if you don't have cyber coverage, I'd recommend, getting a quote for it and considering it.
Okay. And how do people get in touch with you?
In Morris and Garritano, so they can look up our website, morrisgarritano.com, and call the main line or get my contact information there.
Okay.
Yeah, we
And
can
you're on
provide some
LinkedIn, I'm
links.
supposing, too.
Yep.
And then my last
Brian,
word,
last word for you, Brian.
last word of the podcast or webinar, I should say. I think I want to go back to just understanding that, compliance isn't just technology. It isn't just the IT's job, right? And so any healthcare providers, medical offices, any business for that matter, when we want to understand whether or not we're secure, it isn't something that we should be saying my IT handles that, because that would indicate that maybe you don't understand your current security posture and you're not realizing that it is truly a shared responsibility and incorporates people, process, and technology. And really need to just start the conversation of understanding no one's perfect with security. Even if you think your IT's got it, they've got a decent amount maybe, right? But where are the gaps that can be improved, especially around the people and process? I would say security training, phishing awareness is a continued gap. I rarely see organizations really bringing that into their culture and rewarding that. It feels like something they have to do without understanding the importance. How can we make the people of an organization feel more connected to the why behind, compliance and its importance with an organization? So don't be afraid to start the conversation and find gaps. We don't want to bury our head in the sand and assume there aren't gaps. At the same time, we don't want to freak out when we find gaps because it is an ongoing process. Compliance isn't a one-time check. It's an ongoing, continuous improvement. And as long as you're moving the needle and continuously improving, especially to Justin's earlier point, when the company was even found they didn't have MFA, but they were in the process, they were forgiven for that. It was like, well, we understand those things can happen. So start the conversations now with IT. You're not going to get there overnight. Bake it into a regular plan. Maybe you're meeting monthly, quarterly, probably not something you should do yearly to help move the needle and improve your security posture and compliance.
Brian, as always, how do people get in touch with you?
ITECH-solutions.com. I'm also on LinkedIn. Brian Weiss, ITECH Solutions, and you can find us on Google too.